The crystal chandeliers sparkled like diamonds against the high ceiling of the massive mansion. Tonight was the night that millionaire businessman David King had been preparing for months. His annual charity gala was the biggest event of the year, where rich people from all over the city came together to show off their wealth while pretending to care about helping others. David straightened his expensive black tie and checked his reflection in the gold-framed mirror. At 45 years old, he had built a real estate empire worth over $200 million. He owned half the buildings in downtown, lived in a mansion with 20 rooms, and drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. But none of that mattered to him as much as what people thought about him tonight. "Everything must be perfect," he told his assistant while walking through the grand entrance hall. "These people expect the best, and I always deliver the best." The mansion buzzed with activity. Dozens of workers rushed around, setting up tables, arranging flowers, and preparing for the 300 guests who would arrive soon. The catering company had brought their best team to handle such an important event. Among the workers was a woman named Rose Thompson. At 67 years old, she moved a bit slower than the younger staff, but she worked with quiet dignity. Her gray hair was neatly pulled back, and despite wearing the simple black uniform of the catering company, there was something elegant about her. She had kind eyes that seemed to hold many stories, and gentle hands that had clearly worked hard. For many years, Rose needed this job badly. After her husband died 3 years ago, medical bills had eaten up all their savings. Her small pension wasn't enough to cover rent and medicine for her kidney problems. So here she was, working late nights at fancy parties, carrying heavy trays and cleaning up after rich people who never even looked at her face. "Rose, take these champagne glasses to the main room," called the catering manager. "And be extra. Careful tonight, this client pays well, but he's very demanding." Rose nodded and carefully lifted the silver tray holding 12 crystal glasses filled with expensive champagne. Each glass probably cost more than she made in a week. She walked slowly through the mansion, amazed by the artwork on the walls and the thick carpets under her feet. This was a world she had never experienced, even though something about it felt strangely familiar. The guests began arriving in their fancy cars. Women wore dresses that cost thousands of dollars and jewelry that sparkled under the lights. Men strutted around in custom-made suits, talking loudly about their businesses and vacation homes. They laughed at jokes that weren't funny and complimented each other on things that didn't matter. David moved through the crowd like a king greeting his subjects. He shook hands with important politicians, hugged famous actors, and posed for pictures with other wealthy businessmen. Everyone wanted to be seen talking to him. His success made him feel powerful, and tonight he felt like he owned the world. "David, wonderful party as always," said a woman wearing diamonds around her neck. "Your home is absolutely stunning." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." "Only the best for my friends," David replied with a fake smile. He had learned long ago that rich people said nice things to each other even when they didn't mean them. As the evening went on, Rose worked quietly in the background. She refilled drinks, collected empty plates, and made sure everything stayed clean and organized. Most guests didn't even notice her, which was exactly how she preferred it. She had learned that invisible workers heard the most interesting conversations. But then disaster struck. Rose was carrying a fresh tray of champagne glasses through the main room when a guest suddenly stepped backward without looking. He bumped right into her, causing her to stumble. The tray tilted dangerously in her hands as she tried to regain her balance. Most of the glasses stayed on the tray, but a few drops of champagne splashed onto the marble floor. And unfortunately, some of those drops landed on David King's expensive Italian shoes. The entire room seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped, mid-sentence. Everyone turned to look at what had happened. David stared down at his shoes in complete shock, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "What have you done?" he screamed, his voice echoing through the silent room. "Do you have any idea how much these shoes cost? Do you know who I am?" Rose's face turned red with embarrassment. She quickly set down the tray and pulled a clean cloth from her pocket. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me clean that for you right away." But David stepped back, his eyes filled with anger and disgust. "Don't you dare touch me. Look what you've done to my suit." He pointed at a few tiny drops of champagne on his jacket sleeve. "This suit costs more than you make in a year." The guests watched in uncomfortable silence. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. Others looked away, embarrassed by the scene unfolding in front of them. "Sir, it was an accident," Rose said quietly, still holding the cloth. "Please let me fix this." "An accident?" David's voice grew louder and meaner. "This is what happens when you hire people who don't belong in places like this. You people don't understand how to behave around quality things." Those words hit Rose like a physical blow. She had faced discrimination many times in her 67 years, but it never stopped hurting. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly into David's eyes. For just a moment, something flickered in her expression, a look of deep sadness mixed with recognition that David didn't understand. "You people need to learn your place," David continued, his anger building with each word. "This is my home, my party, and my rules. I won't have my guests insulted by clumsy help who can't do their jobs properly." "David, maybe we should calm down," suggested one of the guests, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But David was too angry to listen. He had built his reputation on being tough and demanding. He couldn't let anyone, especially a servant, make him look bad in front of his important friends. "Security!" he shouted. "Get this woman out of my house immediately. I want her banned from working any event in this city. Make sure everyone knows that I won't tolerate this kind of incompetence." 2. Security guards appeared quickly, looking embarrassed about what they had to do. Rose handed her cloth to another worker and walked toward the door with quiet dignity. She didn't argue or make a scene. She had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse for people like her. As the security guards escorted her out, Rose turned back one last time to look at David. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She whispered something so softly that only she could hear. "My sweet boy, what have you become?" The main door closed behind her with a heavy thud, leaving David standing in his perfect mansion, surrounded by his wealthy friends. He brushed the champagne drops off his jacket and forced a smile back onto his face. "Sorry about that, everyone," he announced to the room. "Sometimes you have to remind people about standards. Now, let's get back to having a wonderful evening." But several guests had recorded the entire incident on their phones. Within minutes, the video was uploaded to social media with captions like "Rich man humiliates elderly worker" and "This is what's wrong with wealthy people." The video spread like wildfire, getting thousands of views and comments within the first hour. As Rose walked slowly down the long driveway away from the mansion, she didn't know that her life was about to change forever. She also didn't know that the cruel man who had just humiliated her was connected to her in ways that neither of them could imagine. The night that was supposed to be David's greatest triumph was about to become the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives in ways they never expected. The morning after the charity gala, David King woke up to his worst nightmare. His phone was buzzing non-stop with calls from reporters, business partners, and angry people he had never met. The video of him humiliating Rose had gone viral overnight, with over 2 million views and counting. "Boss, we have a serious problem," his assistant Jenny said, as she burst into his office with a stack of newspapers. "You're on the front page of every major publication in the city." David grabbed the papers and saw his own face staring back at him with headlines like "Millionaire's Meltdown" and "Rich man's cruel treatment of elderly worker shocks the city." His stomach dropped as he read the articles describing him as heartless, cruel, and out of touch with reality. But the real damage was happening online. The video had been shared millions of times across every social media platform. People were posting angry comments calling him a monster and demanding that others boycott his businesses. Someone had even created a hashtag called Justice for Rose that was trending worldwide. "Sir, 3 of our biggest clients have already canceled their contracts," Jenny continued nervously. "The mayor's office called to say they're reviewing all city contracts with your company, and there's a protest planned outside our building this afternoon." David felt his carefully built empire starting to crumble around him. Everything he had worked for his entire life was being destroyed because of one stupid moment. But instead of feeling sorry for what he had done, he felt angry that one old woman could cause him so much trouble. "Find her," he told Jenny through gritted teeth. "Find that woman who caused all this mess." "What do you want me to do when I find her?" Jenny asked carefully. David thought for a moment. He knew he needed to fix this situation quickly before it destroyed his business completely. "I want to make this right. Maybe if I apologize publicly and give her some money, people will forget about this whole thing." But finding Rose Thompson turned out to be harder than expected. The catering company said she had worked for them for only 3 months and had given very little personal information. They had an address, but when Jenny went to check, the apartment manager said Rose had moved out that very morning without leaving a forwarding address. Desperate to find her, David hired the best private investigator in the city, a tough former police detective named Mike Rodriguez. Mike had solved cases that nobody else could crack, and he specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. "I need you to locate this woman as quickly as possible," David told Mike, handing him Rose's employment file and a copy of the viral video. "Money is no object. Find her and find out everything about her background." Mike studied the grainy security footage from the mansion and the few details in Rose's file. "This might take some time, Mr. King. She seems to have covered her tracks pretty well." While Mike began his investigation, David tried to continue with his normal life, but everywhere he went, people recognized him. At restaurants, other customers would stare and whisper. His golf partners canceled their weekly games. Even his housekeeper quit, saying she couldn't work for someone who treated elderly people so badly. Meanwhile, Rose had moved to a small studio apartment across town, paying cash for the first month's rent. She sat alone in the tiny space, surrounded by the few belongings she owned, including an old shoebox that she kept hidden under her bed. Rose pulled out the shoebox and opened it carefully. Inside were faded photographs, old documents, and newspaper clippings she had collected over many years. Her hands shook as she picked up a baby picture of a chubby-cheeked little boy with bright eyes and a big smile. "My sweet Michael," she whispered, touching the photo gently. "I never stopped looking for you." The documents in the box told a heartbreaking story. Rose had been just 17 years old when she gave birth to her son Michael in 1978. She was alone, scared, and struggling with problems that seemed impossible to solve. When Michael was 3 years old, social services took him away from her after she was arrested for stealing baby formula from a grocery store. "You're an unfit mother," the social worker had told her coldly. "This child deserves better than what you can provide." Rose had fought the system for years, trying to get her son back. She attended every court hearing, completed every program they required, and begged every official who would listen. But the legal system had already decided that Michael would be better off with a wealthy family who could give him opportunities she never could. The adoption records were sealed, and Rose was told she would never see her son again. But a mother's love doesn't disappear just because a judge signs a paper. Rose spent the next 20 years searching for any trace of her lost boy. She got clean, earned her high school diploma, and worked multiple jobs while spending every spare dollar hiring private investigators and lawyers to help find Michael. She followed every lead, no matter how small, and never gave up hope that someday she would see her son again. Over the years, Rose had collected newspaper clippings about successful young men who might be her Michael. She read about business, Deals, charity events, and social gatherings, always looking for a face that might resemble the baby she had lost. One name that appeared frequently in the business section was David King, a real estate mogul who had built an empire from nothing. Something about his eyes in the photographs reminded her of her lost son, but she told herself it was just wishful thinking. When Rose saw that David King was hosting a charity gala, she convinced the catering company to let her work the event. She thought that maybe, just maybe, if she could see him in person, she would know for sure if he was her Michael. But when she looked into his eyes that night, she saw a stranger. The kind, gentle boy she remembered had been replaced by a cruel man who looked at her like she was nothing. Even so, something deep in her heart whispered that this angry man might be her son. Back at his office, Mike Rodriguez was making progress on his investigation. He had tracked down Rose's previous addresses, talked to former neighbors, and was slowly putting together the pieces of her life story. "This woman has lived a hard life," Mike told David during their first progress meeting. "She's moved around, a lot, always working low-paying jobs, always paying her bills on time, but never having much left over." "I don't care about her life story," David interrupted impatiently. "I just need you to find her so I can fix this public relations disaster." But Mike was a thorough investigator, and something about Rose's background was bothering him. Her employment records showed gaps of several years in the 1980s, and some of her previous addresses were near the courthouse and social services offices. "Mr. King, there's something else," Mike said slowly. "I found some interesting connections in her past. It looks like she might have had a child who was put up for adoption many years ago." David wasn't really listening. He was too focused on checking his phone for the latest social media updates about the scandal. The hashtag Justice for Rose was still trending, and his company's stock price had dropped 15% in just 3 days. "Just find her," David said dismissively. "I don't have time for ancient history. I need to fix this mess before it destroys everything I've built." Mike nodded, but made a mental note to dig deeper into Rose's connection to the adoption system. Something told him that this case was about to become much more complicated than his client realized. As the investigation continued, neither David nor Rose knew that they were about to discover a truth that would change both of their lives forever. 2 weeks after the viral incident, private investigator Mike Rodriguez sat in his office staring at a file that made his hands shake. He had seen shocking revelations in his 25 years as a detective, but nothing had prepared him for what he had discovered about Rose Thompson and David King. Mike picked up his phone to call David, then put it down again. He had made this same motion 12 times in the past hour. How do you tell a man that he had just humiliated and thrown out his own biological mother? How do you explain that the woman he was hunting down to silence was the same person who had spent decades searching for him? The evidence was overwhelming. Mike had obtained Rose's sealed adoption records through his contacts in the court system. The birth certificate clearly showed that Rose Thompson had given birth to a baby boy named Michael Thompson on March 15, 1978. The adoption papers showed that this same baby had been placed with the wealthy King family and renamed David Michael King. The DNA comparison was the final proof Mike needed. He had collected David's DNA from a coffee cup and compared it to hair samples he had found in Rose's old apartment. The results came back with 99.9% certainty. David King and Rose Thompson were mother and son. Mike had also discovered the heartbreaking details of their separation. Court documents from 1981 painted a picture of a young mother who had made mistakes but was desperately trying to provide for her child. Rose had been arrested for shoplifting baby formula and diapers, not because she was a criminal, but because she was a desperate mother who couldn't afford to feed her son. The social worker's report described Rose as emotionally unstable and financially incapable of providing adequate care. But Mike could read between the lines. Rose had been a teenage mother with no family support, no education, and no money. The system had judged her harshly for being poor, not for being a bad mother. Meanwhile, David had grown up in luxury with adoptive parents who gave him every advantage money could buy. The King family had told him that his birth mother was a drug addict who didn't want him, which wasn't true. They had never mentioned that she had fought for years to get him back. Finally, Mike gathered enough courage to make the phone call. "Mr. King, I need to see you immediately. I've found Rose Thompson, and there's something extremely important you need to know." David was in his office trying to manage the continued fallout from the viral video. Protesters still gathered outside his building every day, and 3 more business partners had ended their relationships with his company. He was losing millions of dollars while his reputation crumbled around him. "Good. Bring her in," David said without looking up from his computer. "I want to offer her money to make a public statement that this whole thing was blown out of proportion." "Sir, you need to come to my office right now," Mike insisted. "This can't wait, and it definitely can't be discussed over the phone." Something in Mike's voice made David pay attention. He had never heard the tough detective sound so serious, almost scared. David grabbed his car keys and drove across town to Mike's office, his mind racing with possibilities. Had Rose done something criminal? Was she planning to sue him? Was there something in her background he could use to discredit her? Mike's office was small and cluttered with case files, but today it felt like the most important room in the world. David sat down across from the detective's desk, expecting to hear information that would help him destroy Rose's credibility. Instead, Mike opened a thick file and pulled out a birth certificate. "Mr. King, I need you to look at this very carefully." David glanced at the old document and saw the name Michael Thompson with a birth date of March 15, 1978. His own birthday. "I don't understand what this has to do with anything." "Keep reading," Mike said quietly. David's eyes moved down the page until he saw the mother's name, Rose Thompson. His heart stopped beating for a moment as the words sank in. This is some kind of mistake. There are millions of people born on the same day. Mike pulled out another document. David's own adoption papers, which he had never seen before. His adoptive parents had hidden them from him his entire life. The papers clearly showed that Michael Thompson, born to Rose Thompson, had been adopted by Robert and Helen King on August 12, 1981. "This can't be real," David whispered, his face turning pale. "My parents told me my birth mother was a drug addict who abandoned me. They said she never wanted me." "Your adoptive parents lied to you," Mike said gently. "Rose fought the system for years trying to get you back. She was just a scared teenager who made some mistakes, but she never stopped loving you." Mike spread out more documents across the desk. Court records showing Rose's attempts to regain custody, letters she had written to judges begging them to let her see her son, and certificates from parenting classes and job training programs she had completed, trying to prove she could be a good mother. David stared at the papers in shock. His entire life story had been built on a lie. The woman he had humiliated and thrown out of his mansion wasn't just some random servant, she was his mother. The mother who had been searching for him for over 40 years. "There's more," Mike continued, pulling out a DNA test report. "I had both of your DNA analyzed. The results confirm everything with 99.9% certainty. Rose Thompson is your biological mother." David felt like the room was spinning around him. He thought about Rose's face that night at the gala, the way she had looked at him with such pain in her eyes. He remembered how she had whispered something he couldn't hear as security escorted her out. "She knew," David said suddenly. "When she looked at me that night, she knew who I was." "I believe so," Mike confirmed. "I found evidence that she had been following your career for years. She had newspaper clippings about your business success, photos from social events, and articles about your charity work. She was proud of you, even though you didn't know she existed." David's hands started shaking as the full weight of what he had done hit him. He had screamed at his own mother, called her "you people," and had her thrown out of his house like Trash. The woman who had given birth to him, who had lost everything trying to keep him, who had spent her life working hard jobs just to survive. He had treated her like she was nothing. "Where is she now?" David asked, his voice breaking. "That's the problem," Mike said sadly. "She's disappeared again. After the incident went viral, she moved out of her apartment and hasn't been seen since. I think she's hiding because she's afraid of more public attention." David realized that while he had been worried about his reputation and his money, Rose had been dealing with something much more painful. She had finally found her son after 40 years of searching, only to discover that he had grown up to be exactly the kind of person who would treat her cruelly. "I have to find her," David said, standing up quickly. "I have to apologize. I have to explain that I didn't know." "It's not going to be that simple," Mike warned. "Think about this from her perspective. She spent 40 years wondering what happened to her baby boy. She probably imagined reuniting with you thousands of times. But instead of the loving reunion she dreamed of, her son humiliated her in front of hundreds of people." David sat back, down heavily, the full impact of his actions finally hitting him. He had destroyed the most important relationship of his life before he even knew it existed. The viral video that was ruining his business was nothing compared to the pain he had caused the one person who had loved him longest. "Help me find her," David pleaded. "I don't care what it costs or how long it takes. I have to make this right." Finding Rose proved to be the hardest thing David had ever done in his life. For 3 weeks, he and Mike searched every homeless shelter, community center, and low-income housing area in the city. David had never set foot in these neighborhoods before, and seeing how people lived when they had nothing made him understand how privileged his life had been. "She's smart," Mike told David as they sat in his car outside another dead-end location. "She knows how to disappear, and she has good reason to hide from public attention." David stared out the window at children playing in a rundown playground. "What if she doesn't want to see me? What if I've hurt her so badly that she never wants to face me again?" "That's a risk you'll have to take," Mike replied honestly. "But from what I learned about her, Rose has a good heart. She might be willing to listen if you approach her the right way." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. David's housekeeper, Maria, had seen the viral video and read about the search for Rose in the newspaper. She called David with information that would change everything. "Mr. King, I think I know where your mother might be," Maria said nervously over the phone. "My sister works at St. Mary's Community Kitchen downtown. She says there's an older woman who started volunteering there recently who looks exactly like the lady in the video." David's heart raced. St. Mary's Community Kitchen was a place where volunteers served free meals to homeless people and families struggling to put food on the table. It was exactly the kind of place where Rose would feel comfortable helping others, who had faced hard times like she had. David arrived at St. Mary's early the next morning before the kitchen opened for lunch service. The building was old and plain, nothing like the fancy places David usually visited. But as he walked through the front door, he felt more nervous than he had ever felt in his life. The kitchen was busy with volunteers preparing hundreds of meals. David scanned the room, looking for a familiar face among the people chopping vegetables and stirring large pots of soup. Then he saw her. Rose stood at a long table, carefully packing sandwiches into brown paper bags. She wore simple clothes, and her gray hair was pulled back with the same dignity she had shown at his mansion. Even though she was doing humble work, there was something beautiful about the way she moved with purpose and care. For a moment, David couldn't move. This woman had given birth to him, had fought to keep him, had searched for him for 40 years, and had loved him even when he treated her terribly. She was his mother, and he had almost destroyed any chance of knowing her. Rose must have sensed someone watching her because she looked up from her work. When she saw David standing in the doorway, her hands stopped moving and her face went pale. The other volunteers continued their work around them, unaware that a life-changing moment was happening right in front of them. David walked slowly toward her, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. "Rose," he said quietly. When he reached her table, "My name is David King, but I think you knew me as Michael." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She studied his face carefully, seeing the little boy she had lost in the features of the successful man he had become. "I know who you are," she whispered finally. "I've always known." "Can we talk somewhere private?" David asked. "I have so much I need to say to you." Rose nodded and led him to a small office behind the kitchen. They sat across from each other at a tiny desk covered with volunteer schedules and donation receipts. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. There were 40 years of separation between them, and neither knew how to begin bridging that gap. "I'm sorry," David said finally, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you that night. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I'm sorry I didn't know who you were." "You couldn't have known," Rose replied softly. "I never tried to contact you because I thought you were better off without me. I thought you had a good family who loved you." "They did love me," David admitted, "but they lied to me about you. They told me you were a drug addict who didn't want me. They made me believe that you abandoned me." Rose closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I made mistakes when you were little. I was young and scared, and I didn't know how to be a good mother. But I never stopped wanting you. I never stopped loving you." David reached across the desk and took her hands in his. They were rough from years of hard work, but they were the hands that had once held him as a baby. "Tell me about those years. Tell me what really happened." Rose began to share her story, how she had been just 17 when he was born, how she had tried her best to take care of him, even though she barely had enough money for food, how losing him to the adoption system had broken her heart, but motivated her to become a better person. "I got clean, I went back to school, I worked every job I could find," she explained. "I kept thinking that if I could prove I had changed, maybe someday I would get another chance to be your mother." "You never remarried? You never had other children?" David asked. "How could I?" Rose smiled sadly. "My heart belonged to a little boy I thought I would never see again. I spent 40 years wondering if you were happy, if you were healthy, if you knew that somewhere in the world, your mother was thinking about you every single day." David felt tears running down his face. He had spent his whole life building wealth and power, but he had never understood what real love looked like until this moment. Rose had lost everything because of him, but she had never stopped loving him. "I want to make up for lost time," David said urgently. "I want to take care of you now. You shouldn't be living in small apartments and working jobs that are too hard for you. Let me help you." Rose shook her head gently. "I don't need your money, son. I need something much more valuable than that." "What do you need?" "I need to know that the little boy I loved grew up to be a good man. I need to know that even though we were apart, you learned how to treat people with kindness and respect." David felt ashamed when he thought about the man he had become. Someone who looked down on people like his own mother, someone who valued money more than human dignity. "I haven't been a good man," he admitted, "but I want to learn how to be better. Will you teach me?" Rose smiled for the first time since their conversation began. "We can learn together." Over the next few months, David's life changed completely. He moved Rose into his mansion, not as hired help, but as his honored mother. He began volunteering at St. Mary's Community Kitchen, where he learned the names and stories of people he had once considered invisible. David used his wealth to create the Rose Thompson Foundation, which helped reunite families separated by poverty and provided support for single mothers struggling to keep their children. Rose became the foundation's director, using her life experience to help other families avoid the pain she had endured. The viral video that had once threatened to destroy David's reputation became the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. They held their first foundation fundraiser in the same mansion where Rose had once been thrown out, but this time she stood beside David as they welcomed guests together. "This is my mother," David told the crowd proudly. "She taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about love, forgiveness, and second chances." Rose took the microphone and spoke to the audience with quiet strength. "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become doorways to the best moments. My son and I lost 40 years together, but we're not going to waste a single day of the time we have left." The mother and son, who had found each other in the most unlikely way, now worked side by side, healing the world one family at a time while making up for all the years they had lost.